The Philip Morris family is one of the most formidable and enduring corporate dynasties in global history, synonymous with the tobacco trade, marketing genius, and unparalleled commercial influence. Their empire was originally established by Philip Morris, a London tobacconist, but was transformed into a global superpower by a succession of American executives who created the world's largest cigarette manufacturer and the iconic Marlboro brand. Spanning nearly 2 centuries, this corporate family has shaped the advertising, lobbying, and legal landscapes of the modern world, eventually evolving into a conglomerate with a market capitalization exceeding $80 billion today. Their wealth has been sustained through strategic diversification and aggressive litigation, while their cultural legacy includes defining the very concept of lifestyle marketing. Despite their commercial triumphs, the history of the Philip Morris family remains permanently stained by the tobacco wars, persistent allegations of scientific fraud regarding cancer risks, and a legacy of addiction that has claimed millions of lives, from a small shop to a global graveyard. The roots of this deadly empire lie buried in the fog of Victorian London, inside a cramped aromatic shop on Bond Street, opened in 1847. Here, Philip Morris courted the British elite, selling tobacco as a harmless indulgence for gentlemen in velvet smoking jackets. He built his name on the leaf, yet the leaf would ultimately consume him. In 1873, the founder's life was cut short at the startlingly young age of 38. His collapse was swift and brutal, attributed to a vague, lingering respiratory illness, a 19th century euphemism for what modern medicine would recognize as lung cancer. He spent his final moments gasping for the very air his products displaced, leaving his widow, Margaret, and brother, Leopold, to inherit a legacy that was, from its very inception, baptized in the blood of its creator. For the next 30 years, the family ran the business as a modest purveyor of Turkish cigarettes, but the center of gravity was shifting. In 1902, the brand crossed the Atlantic. It was incorporated in New York by Gustav Eckmeyer, an agent who understood that the future of tobacco lay not in the hand-rolled refinement of London, but in the industrial speed of America. This transition marked the death of the family business and the birth of the corporation. In 1919, a group of American investors led by George J. Whelan bought the rights to the name. They were not tobacconists, they were financiers. They reorganized the entity as a Virginia corporation, severing the final blood tie to the Morris family. The Philip Morris's name became a ghost, a mask worn by American capitalists to sell a British heritage they did not possess. The 1920s brought a cultural revolution that Philip Morris was eager to exploit: the liberation of women. Before the Jazz Age, it was considered taboo for a woman to smoke in public, but the new owners saw half the population as an untapped market. In 1924, they launched a new brand named after the street where the original London factory had stood, Marlboro. But this was not the Marlboro of the cowboy. This was Marlboro for ladies. It was a product designed with cynical precision. The slogan was, "Mild as May." The cigarettes featured a red band around the filter called a beauty tip, specifically engineered to hide the unsightly stains of lipstick that might mar a lady's appearance. The advertising campaigns featured elegant flappers in silk dresses, smoking delicately at garden parties. Philip Morris was not selling nicotine, they were selling sophistication. They were teaching American women that inhaling carcinogenic smoke was a feminist act, a symbol of modernity and equality. For decades, Marlboro remained a niche, effeminate brand, a luxury item for the wealthy woman who wanted to look like a movie star while she destroyed her lungs. However, the true explosion of the industry, the moment tobacco transitioned from a luxury to a necessity, occurred during the World War II. This was the greatest marketing opportunity in human history, subsidized by the United States government. Under the direction of the War Department, cigarettes were classified as an essential ration for soldiers. General John Pershing famously telegraphed Washington, "You ask me what we need to win this war, I answer tobacco as much as bullets." Philip Morris and its rivals ramped up production to unprecedented levels. They shipped billions of cigarettes to the front lines in Europe and the Pacific. These cigarettes were free. They were handed out in mess halls, in foxholes, and in hospital wards. For millions of young American men, some as young as 18, the cigarette became a coping mechanism for terror, boredom, and pain. The nicotine bonded with their adrenaline, creating a physiological association between smoking and survival. When the war ended in 1945, the troops returned home, but they did not leave their habits on the battlefield. They brought the addiction with them. An entire generation of American men was now hooked. They smoked in offices, in restaurants, in airplanes, and in their homes, blowing smoke into the faces of their children. The cigarette had become the peace pipe of the American century, a ubiquitous accessory of the victorious middle class. Philip Morris rode this wave of addiction to massive profits in the late 1940s. Their stock price soared. The executives in New York congratulated themselves on their patriotism and their prosperity. They ignored the coughing. They ignored the fact that smokers' cough was becoming a national sound. As the 1940s drew to a close, the biological bill for the war began to arrive, presented not by generals, but by thoracic surgeons. In hospitals across America and Britain, doctors were noticing a terrifying anomaly. Lung cancer, once an incredibly rare disease, so rare that medical students in the 1920s would gather around to see a single case, was suddenly becoming an epidemic. Surgeons were opening up the chests of men in their 40s and 50s, men who had survived the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of Guadalcanal, only to find lungs that were black, hard, and riddled with tumors. These were the men who had picked up the habit in the trenches, believing it was a harmless comfort. Now, they were dying in agony, drowning in their own fluids. The medical community began to ask questions. In 1948 and 1949, researchers began to conduct retrospective studies, interviewing lung cancer patients about their habits. The data was stark and disturbing. Almost every single patient was a heavy smoker. The correlation was visible to the naked eye, but it lacked the statistical rigor to challenge a multi-billion-dollar industry that was woven into the fabric of American culture. The tipping point arrived in May 1950. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, two researchers named Dr. Ernst Winder and Dr. Evarts Graham published a landmark study that would change the world. They had studied 684 cases of lung cancer. Their conclusion was a statistical bombshell. 96.5% of the men with lung cancer were moderate to heavy smokers. The study systematically dismantled other theories, like road tar or industrial pollution, and pointed the finger directly at the cigarette. The link was not just probable, it was undeniable. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, the British researcher Richard Dahl published similar findings in the British Medical Journal. The science was converging from both sides of the ocean. The original sin was no longer a theological concept or a vague suspicion. It was a medical fact. The product killed the consumer. Inside the headquarters of Philip Morris in New York, the mood shifted from post-war triumph to existential dread. The executives read the Winder-Graham report. They realized that the golden age of ignorance was over. They were standing on a precipice. If the public accepted that cigarettes caused cancer, the industry would be destroyed. They were selling a product that was no longer just a vice. It was a lethal weapon. They faced a moral choice. They could accept the science, warn their customers, and pivot the business toward safer products. Or they could fight the truth. Why did they invent the cowboy to hide the chemical truth? In 1953, a researcher at the Sloan Kettering Institute named Dr. Ernst Winder, the same man who had sounded the alarm 3 years earlier, conducted an experiment that would haunt the dreams of the tobacco lords. He shaved the backs of laboratory mice and painted them with the distilled tar from cigarette smoke. The results were grotesque. The mice didn't just get sick, they developed massive malignant carcinomas. Their skin rotted and mutated. It was the first visual proof that the tar trapped in a smoker's lungs was a direct agent of death. Inside Philip Morris, the executives did not need Dr. Winder to tell them this. Their own internal scientists had replicated similar tests. They knew. The reports sitting on the mahogany desks of the Coleman family, the dynastic rulers of the company, were unequivocal. They were selling a product that biologically disintegrated the human body. This moment, the winter of 1953, was the moral crossroads for the dynasty. Joseph F. Coleman III, the rising star of the family and future CEO, was a man of impeccable breeding. He was a Yale graduate, a naval officer, and a pillar of New York society. He was not a gangster, he was a gentleman. And yet, faced with the irrefutable evidence that his family business was a mass murderer, Coleman did not recoil. He did not order a recall. He did not warn the public. Instead, he and his colleagues made a cold, calculated decision to declare war on the truth. On December 14, 1953, the heads of the major tobacco companies, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco, and others, gathered for a secret summit at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. It was a meeting that would rival the Appalachian Mafia Summit in its significance to organized crime, though these men wore bespoke suits and smoked in public. The titans of the industry were terrified. Their stock prices were falling. They needed a strategy to survive the cancer scare. They turned to John Hill, the founder of the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. Hill was a master manipulator, a mercenary of public opinion. He told the gathered CEOs that they could not deny the cancer link directly. That would be a lie too easily disproven. Instead, he proposed a psychological masterstroke. They shouldn't fight the facts, they should fight the certainty. Hill's strategy was codified in a single devastating phrase that would define the next 50 years of the industry. Doubt is our product. If they could convince the public that there was still doubt about the science, that more research was needed, they could keep people smoking for decades. They didn't need to prove cigarettes were safe. They just needed to prove that the case against them wasn't closed. Joseph Coleman III and his peers agreed. They signed a pact of blood. They agreed to jointly fund a fake research organization called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Ideally, this committee would be staffed by independent scientists who would be paid to find any other cause for cancer: pollution, genetics, viruses, stress, anything but cigarettes. On January 4th, 1954, the conspiracy went public. Philip Morris and its rivals published a full-page advertisement in 448 newspapers across America, reaching 43 million people. It was titled A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. It was the lie of the century. In the ad, the distinguished authorities of the tobacco industry, signed by the presidents of every major company, looked the American public in the eye and lied. We accept an interest in people's health as a basic responsibility, paramount to every other consideration in our business. The statement read. They promised to fund research. They promised transparency. They promised that they believed their products were not injurious to health. Joseph Coleman III knew this was false. He knew about the mice. He knew about the tar, but he signed his name to the pact. In that moment, the dynasty ceased to be a legitimate business enterprise and became a conspiracy to defraud the public. They had looked at the bodies piling up in the cancer wards and decided that their profits were worth the price. But a lie alone was not enough to save the business. They needed a distraction. They needed a product that looked safer, even if it wasn't. They needed a placebo for the anxious smoker. This was the genesis of the filter cigarette. In the early 1950s, Philip Morris engineers scrambled to attach a plug of cellulose acetate to the end of their cigarettes. The filter was a marketing gimmick, a piece of theater. It turned the filter brown as you smoked, giving the visual impression that it was trapping the toxins. In reality, the smoker simply inhaled harder to get the nicotine kick, drawing the smoke deeper into the lungs. The filter didn't stop the cancer. It just changed where the tumor would form. Yet Philip Morris marketed the filter as a technological shield. They preyed on the fear they had helped create. But they had a problem. Their filtered brand, Marlboro, was still seen as a woman's cigarette, stained by its mild-as-May history. Men, the primary smokers, viewed filters as effeminate. They wanted the real taste of unfiltered tobacco, even if it killed them. Joseph Coleman III realized that to sell the safer cigarette to men, he had to wrap it in the most aggressive, hyper-masculine imagery imaginable. He had to overcompensate. He needed to take the sissy cigarette and turn it into a symbol of testosterone. He turned to Leo Burnett, a legendary advertising executive in Chicago. Coleman gave Burnett a desperate brief. Take this woman's cigarette and make it something a construction worker would smoke. Burnett came back with a concept that was radical in its simplicity. He presented a series of images of rugged men, sea captains, weightlifters, construction workers. But there was one image that stopped Coleman cold. It was a photograph of a cowboy. The cowboy was an archetype. He was the solitary American hero. He was tough, independent, and weathered. He lived outdoors in the clean air of the West, far away from the cancer wards and the laboratories. He was the antithesis of the sick, coughing city dweller. In 1954, the decision was made. The beauty tip was gone. The mild-as-May slogan was buried. In their place, Philip Morris unleashed the Marlboro Man. The first ads did not use models. They used real cowboys. One of the first faces of the campaign was a Navy lieutenant named Robert Bob Norris. He was rugged, handsome, and authentic. The ads showed him on a horse roping cattle with a cigarette dangling effortlessly from his lips. The caption didn't talk about health or filters. It simply said Marlboro country. The psychological impact was nuclear. The campaign tapped into a deep primal insecurity in the American male. The post-war man was working in an office, trapped in a gray flannel suit. Worried about his mortgage and his health, the Marlboro Man offered him an escape. It whispered that if he smoked this cigarette, he wasn't a cog in a machine. He was a cowboy. He was free. Sales exploded. In 1955, Marlboro sales jumped 5,000%. It went from a fringe brand to a market leader almost overnight. Joseph Coleman III had pulled off the greatest magic trick in corporate history. He had taken a deadly, addictive product that was under attack by science, and he had rebranded it as a symbol of vitality and freedom. But there was a grim reality behind the photo shoot. The cowboys who were hired to sell this fantasy were not immune to the product they peddled. They were human beings with lungs, and they were inhaling the same carcinogens that had killed the mice in Dr. Winder's lab. As the money rolled into the Coleman family trust funds, the men who posed for the cameras began to cough. The curse that had taken the founder, Philip Morris, was coming for the cowboys, and the executives in New York were perfectly happy to watch them die, as long as they looked good doing it. By 1957, the Marlboro Man campaign had done more than just sell cigarettes. It had crowned a new king, Joseph F. Coleman III, the architect of the rebranding, was named president and CEO of Philip Morris. Under his reign, the Coleman dynasty solidified its grip on the company, transforming it from a family business into a terrifyingly efficient corporate monarchy. Joseph was the epitome of the American patrician, a World War II naval officer, a philanthropist, and a sportsman who bred hunting dogs. He moved effortlessly through the elite circles of New York and Washington, using his charm to mask the brutal reality of the industry he controlled. He viewed the cigarette business not as a vice, but as a noble commercial endeavor, dismissing the mounting casualty lists as statistical aberrations or attacks on personal freedom. But while Coleman managed the public image, a far darker revolution was taking place inside the company's secret laboratories in Richmond, Virginia. The marketing of the Marlboro Man had brought men to the brand, but the executives knew that marketing alone could not keep them there. To ensure total loyalty, to ensure that a customer would continue to buy the product even as it destroyed his lungs, Philip Morris needed to hack the biology of the smoker. In the late 1950s, Philip Morris scientists made a discovery that would remain one of the industry's most closely guarded secrets for 40 years. They found that by adding ammonia to the tobacco leaf during the manufacturing process, they could fundamentally alter the chemistry of nicotine. In its natural state, nicotine is a salt. It is absorbed slowly by the body, but when treated with ammonia, it transforms into a free base. This free base nicotine is volatile. When heated and inhaled, it crosses the blood-brain barrier with the speed and violence of a lightning strike. It hits the brain in seconds, delivering a dopamine rush that is significantly more potent and more addictive than untreated tobacco. In layman's terms, Philip Morris had discovered the chemistry of crack cocaine decades before drug dealers on the street did. They weren't just selling tobacco. They were selling a hyper-engineered drug delivery device. This chemical manipulation was the secret sauce behind the explosive growth of Marlboro. Smokers didn't know why they preferred Marlboro to Winston or Camel. They just knew that other cigarettes felt weak by comparison. They were physically addicted to the ammonia-boosted kick. Joseph Coleman III sanctioned the use of this technology, turning his customers into chemical prisoners. The cowboy killer was now armed with a weapon that made it nearly impossible to quit. As the 1960s dawned, the Marlboro Man became ubiquitous. The campaign expanded from newspapers to television. The commercials were cinematic masterpieces accompanied by the stirring theme from the Magnificent Seven. They showed rugged men in sheepskin coats herding horses through snow-dusted canyons. They sold a fantasy of clean air and boundless health to men who were slowly suffocating in suburbs. But the reality of the Marlboro Men themselves was a gruesome counter-narrative that the company ruthlessly suppressed. These were not actors. They were real cowboys and rodeo riders hired for their authenticity. Men like David McLean and Wayne McLaren were paid to smoke pack after pack for the cameras, sometimes requiring dozens of takes to get the smoke plume to curl just right in the light. Behind the scenes, these icons of masculinity were beginning to rot. The curse that had taken Philip Morris in 1873 was now claiming his avatars. They developed persistent coughs. They lost weight. Their skin turned gray. But they were contractually bound to the brand their dying bodies used to sell the very instrument of their destruction. The executives in New York sent them checks, but they did not send warnings. They viewed the cowboys as livestock, assets to be used up and replaced. However, the wall of silence that Coleman and the Tobacco Trust had built in 1953 was beginning to crack under the pressure of undeniable science. The medical evidence was piling up like bodies in a morgue. By 1962, the pressure on the U.S. government to act became insurmountable. President John F. Kennedy, himself a cigar smoker, authorized the creation of a Surgeon General's Advisory Committee to review the data. For 2 years, the committee reviewed over 7,000 scientific articles. The tobacco industry lobbyists, led by the Coleman family's operatives, fought them at every step. They tried to water down the language. They tried to stack the committee with sympathetic scientists. They argued that the data was statistical, not causal. But on a Saturday morning, chosen to minimize the crash of the stock market, January 11, 1964, the Surgeon General Dr. Luther Terry locked the press in a room and released the report. It was a bombshell. The report, Smoking and Health, stated unequivocally that cigarette smoking was a cause of lung cancer and laryngeal cancer in men, a probable cause of lung cancer in women, and the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. It was the official end of the Great Deception. The U.S. government had finally declared war on the cigarette. Inside the Philip Morris boardroom, the release of the report was viewed as a declaration of war. Joseph Coleman III did not apologize. He did not recall the product. He did not stop the ammonia injections. Instead, he ordered a counteroffensive. He went on television. In a series of interviews that defined the banality of corporate evil, Coleman looked into the camera and, with the calm assurance of a man who believes his own lies, disputed the Surgeon General. He famously stated, "We do not believe that cigarettes are hazardous to health." He cited the industry's own sham research to claim there was a controversy. But Coleman was a pragmatist. He knew he couldn't fight the government forever. So in 1965, he pulled a legal judo move that would protect his family's fortune for another 40 years. The U.S. Congress was preparing to pass a law requiring warning labels on cigarette packs. Most industries would fight this, but Coleman and the other tobacco lords quietly supported it. Why? Because their lawyers had identified a loophole called preemption. They realized that if the federal government mandated a warning label, caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health, it would inoculate the companies against lawsuits. If a smoker got cancer and tried to sue Philip Morris, the company could point to the label and say, "We warned you. You assumed the risk." In 1965, the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act was passed. To the public, it looked like a victory for health. To Joseph Coleman III, it was the ultimate liability shield. He had successfully shifted the blame from the seller to the buyer. The merchants of death had bought themselves a license to kill, signed by Congress. Secure in their legal immunity, Philip Morris hit the gas pedal. They didn't shrink from the bad news. They marketed around it. They realized that men might be getting scared of cancer, so they needed a new demographic to replace the dying. They needed a fresh supply of lungs. They turned their eyes to the one group they had largely ignored since the 1920s, women. And they were about to launch a campaign that would be as culturally potent and as lethal as the Marlboro Man. By the mid-1960s, Joseph Coleman III and his marketing lieutenant George Weissman faced a demographic crisis that threatened the long-term viability of their empire. The Surgeon General's report of 1964 had terrified American men. For the first time in history, smoking rates among adult males began a slow, irrevocable decline. The Marlboro Man was still a potent icon, but the reality of lung cancer was penetrating the psyche of the white-collar provider. To maintain their double-digit growth, the executives at Philip Morris needed a replacement population. They needed a demographic that was historically under-smoking and ripe for manipulation. They turned their gaze to women. Since the failure of the original mild as May Marlboro in the 1920s, the tobacco industry had largely treated women as a secondary market. But the late 1960s offered a unique cultural opening. The second-wave feminist movement was sweeping the country. Women were burning bras, demanding equal pay, and breaking into the workforce. George Weissman, a man with a keen eye for cultural shifts, realized that Philip Morris could co-opt this struggle for liberation and package it into a cigarette. In 1968, Philip Morris launched Virginia Slims. This was not just a new brand. It was a cynical masterstroke of psychological warfare. The cigarette itself was physically distinct, thinner and longer than a standard smoke, designed to appeal to the female desire for slenderness and elegance. But the product was secondary to the message. The advertising campaign, created by the Leo Burnett Agency, explicitly linked nicotine addiction to women's rights. The slogan was catchy, patronizing, and devastatingly effective. "You've come a long way, baby." The television commercials and print ads featured then and now vignettes. They showed sepia-toned images of oppressed women from the early 1900s, sneaking a smoke behind a barn, being scolded by husbands, contrasted with full-color images of modern, vibrant, independent women striding confidently through the world, holding a Virginia Slim. The message was subliminal but clear. Smoking isn't a dirty habit. It is an act of rebellion. It is proof that you are equal to men. You have the right to vote, the right to work, and the right to destroy your lungs just like the boys. The campaign worked with lethal efficiency. Smoking rates among teenage girls skyrocketed. For the first time, the gender gap in nicotine addiction began to close. But biology does not respect marketing. As women began to smoke like men, they began to die like men. In the decades following the launch of Virginia Slims, the rate of lung cancer among women exploded. By 1987, lung cancer would surpass breast cancer as the #1 killer of American women, a statistical anomaly that epidemiological historians attribute directly to the aggressive marketing of brands like Virginia Slims. The liberation that Weissman and Coleman sold was a trap. They had persuaded a generation of women to chain themselves to a carcinogen in the name of freedom. While Philip Morris was conquering the female market, the company was also aggressively solidifying its grip on the media. By the late 1960s, the tobacco industry was the single largest advertiser on television. I Love Lucy, The Flintstones, and the nightly news were all brought to the American living room by cigarette money. This financial stranglehold made the networks hesitant to report on the growing health crisis. However, the legal environment was shifting. A crusading lawyer named John Bonzoff successfully argued to the Federal Communications Commission that the fairness doctrine applied to cigarette ads. If TV stations aired commercials telling people smoking was glamorous, they had to air anti-smoking messages, telling them it was deadly. Suddenly, for every 3 Marlboro commercials, viewers saw 1 PSA from the American Cancer Society. These anti-smoking spots were terrifyingly effective. They didn't use cowboys, they used skeletons. They showed real lungs. They were eroding the glamour that Philip Morris spent millions to create. Faced with this PR disaster, Joseph Coleman III made a counterintuitive Machiavellian decision. He decided to kill his own television advertising. In 1969, Coleman went before Congress. He offered a voluntary ban on all cigarette advertising on television and radio. To the politicians, this looked like a concession, a noble act of corporate responsibility. In reality, it was a strategic retreat designed to save the industry. Coleman knew that the anti-smoking PSAs were hurting the industry more than the cigarette ads were helping it. By agreeing to ban his ads, he effectively killed the requirement for the anti-smoking ads. He removed the terrifying images of cancer from the airwaves, leaving only the silence. Furthermore, the ban froze the market share. Philip Morris, with Marlboro as the dominant leader, knew that banning TV ads would prevent smaller competitors from launching new brands to challenge them. It locked in their monopoly. On January 1, 1971, the last cigarette commercial aired on American television. The screen went black on the Marlboro Man. But the cowboy didn't die, he just moved. Philip Morris redirected its massive advertising budget into print, billboards, and, most insidiously, sports sponsorship. They plastered the Marlboro logo on Formula One cars and tennis tournaments. They associated smoking with speed, athleticism, and victory. As the 1960s ended, the Philip Morris family, not by blood but by corporate lineage, sat atop a mountain of ash. They had weathered the science, co-opted the government, and seduced the women of America. But the curse was patient. The first generation of Marlboro men were beginning to feel a tightness in their chests. David McLean, the rugged star of the print ads, was developing a persistent cough that would eventually be diagnosed as emphysema. Wayne McLaren, another cowboy model, was noticing the first signs of the cancer that would eat his lungs. The executives in New York, men like Coleman and Weissman, dined in the finest restaurants, celebrated as captains of industry. They insulated themselves with art collections and philanthropy, but they could not insulate themselves from the biological reality of their product. The 1970s were approaching, and the era of doubt was about to evolve into an era of Frankenstein science, where the company would stop just hiding the truth and start genetically engineering the leaf to make it harder to escape. By the end of 1970, the landscape of the American tobacco empire had been radically terraformed. The original sin of the founder's death was now a distant memory, replaced by a sophisticated, industrialized system of denial. But while Joseph Coleman III and George Weissman were celebrating their victories over the regulators and the successful launch of Virginia Slims, a quiet, more personal tragedy was beginning to unfold within the ranks of the company's own icons. The men who had been paid to embody the rugged health of the Marlboro Man were starting to die. While the marketing department was busy painting the world red and white, the biological reality of the product began to collect its debt. The iconic Marlboro men, those rugged symbols of vitality, began to wither. David McLean and Wayne McLaren, who had smoked thousands of packs for the cameras, both succumbed to the very cancer they helped glamorize. Their deaths were not just personal tragedies, they were biological evidence that pierced the corporate armor. McLean died tethered to an oxygen tank, while McLaren spent his final days as an anti-smoking crusader, whispering warnings through medical tubes. Yet Philip Morris viewed these deaths merely as depreciated assets. Instead of mourning, they fought the widows in court, dismissing the dying cowboys as willing participants, while simultaneously engineering a new weapon in their labs to ensure the next generation wouldn't care about the risks. But inside the Philip Morris laboratories, the scientists were working on a way to make the product even harder to quit, ensuring that the next generation of customers would be locked in for life. In the late 1960s, company researchers began experimenting with additives. They realized that simply selling tobacco leaves was inefficient. They needed to engineer a better delivery system. They began to add sugar, cocoa, and licorice to the blend. These weren't just for flavor. When burned, sugar produces acetaldehyde, a chemical that acts as a bronchodilator, opening up the lungs to allow the smoke to penetrate deeper. Cocoa contains theobromine, which also expands the airways. They were turning the cigarette into a chemical weapon designed to bypass the body's natural defenses. But the most significant innovation remained the ammonia technology. By freebasing the nicotine, they increased the kick, the speed at which the drug hit the brain. This created a more intense, harder-to-break addiction. It was a Franken cigarette, a product engineered in a lab to enslave the user's dopamine receptors. As the 1970s began, the executives at Philip Morris felt secure. They had banned TV ads, they had captured the female market, and they had chemically engineered a product that was chemically superior to their rivals. But they had underestimated the power of a new enemy. The anti-smoking movement was no longer just a few doctors writing papers. It was becoming a political force. Activists were demanding non-smokers' rights. They were pushing for bans on smoking in public places. The cultural tide was turning. The cigarette, once a symbol of sophistication, was slowly becoming a symbol of pollution. And deep within the company, a new generation of scientists was beginning to feel the weight of their conscience. They were reading the internal memos. They were seeing the data on ammonia and cancer. And one of them, a brilliant researcher who would join the company in the coming years, was already beginning to question the morality of working for the merchants of death. His name was Jeffrey Wigand, and he would become the man who finally burned the house down. The light cigarette fraud. On the morning of January 1st, 1971, the television screens of America fell silent on the subject of tobacco. The Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act had taken effect at the stroke of midnight, banning all cigarette commercials from the airwaves. For the first time in 20 years, the Marlboro man was not riding across the primetime plains, and the Virginia Slims woman was not strutting through the commercial breaks of The Tonight Show. To the anti-smoking crusaders and public health officials, this moment felt like a decisive victory, a turning of the tide against the merchants of death. They believed that by cutting off the industry's loudest megaphone, they had severed the connection between the cigarette and the American dream. They were wrong. For the executives at Philip Morris, the ban was not a defeat. It was a strategic liberation. By being forced off television, they were freed from the fairness doctrine, which had required broadcasters to air one terrifying anti-smoking PSA for every 3 cigarette commercials. With the ban in place, the images of blackened lungs and dying patients disappeared from the screen just as quickly as the cowboys. The debate was silenced, but the addiction remained. Joseph Coleman III and his marketing genius, George Weissman, simply took the hundreds of millions of dollars they had been spending on TV spots and weaponized it in a new, more insidious direction: sports. If they couldn't buy commercials, they would buy the events themselves. They realized that if they plastered their logos on race cars and tennis courts, the cameras would have to film them anyway. It was a loophole of invisible marketing that would define the decade. In the 1970s, Philip Morris became the primary patron of global motorsports. They painted the McLaren and Ferrari Formula One cars in the iconic red and white chevron of the Marlboro pack. When a driver like James Hunt or Niki Lauda stood on the podium, drenched in champagne, the Marlboro logo was emblazoned across his chest. The message was subliminal and powerful. Smoking was not about sickness. It was about speed, danger, and victory. It associated the inhalation of carcinogens with the peak of physical performance and masculine bravery. Simultaneously, to protect the Virginia Slims brand, Philip Morris co-opted the world of women's tennis. They sponsored the Virginia Slims Circuit, a professional tour that offered unprecedented prize money to female athletes. They enlisted legends like Billie Jean King, who became a walking billboard for the brand. It was a masterclass in cynical branding. The company that was selling a product that caused emphysema and heart disease was positioning itself as the champion of women's health and athletic equality. When critics pointed out the irony, the company hid behind the shield of feminism, arguing that they were empowering women to make their own choices, even if that choice was to die of lung cancer. But while the marketing department was busy painting the world red and white, the legal and scientific departments were engaged in a much darker project. They were building the doubt factory. By the mid-1970s, the scientific consensus on smoking and cancer was absolute. There was no longer any legitimate debate in the medical community. To counter this, Philip Morris and its rivals had to manufacture a fake debate. They transformed the Tobacco Industry Research Committee into the Council for Tobacco Research, a grant-making body that functioned as a money laundering operation for friendly science. The CTR handed out millions of dollars to researchers who were willing to explore alternative theories for cancer. They funded studies on stress, on genetics, on nutrition, on air pollution, anything that could be used to say, well, it might not be the cigarettes. They championed the constitutional hypothesis, a scientific gaslight which suggested that some people were just genetically predisposed to both lung cancer and smoking, implying that the cigarette was an innocent bystander to a genetic tragedy. This strategy of paralysis by analysis was codified in a now infamous internal memo from 1969, written by a Brown and Williamson executive but embraced by the entire cartel. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. But the most sinister evolution of the 1970s happened deep inside the laboratories of Richmond, Virginia. As health-conscious smokers began to panic, they demanded safer cigarettes. They wanted low-tar, low-nicotine options. Philip Morris responded with the invention of light cigarettes. These cigarettes featured a high-tech innovation, ventilation holes. The filter was perforated with tiny microscopic holes that were supposed to mix fresh air with the smoke, diluting the tar and nicotine before it entered the lungs. When tested on the government's smoking machines, robots that smoked cigarettes in a standardized rhythm, the light cigarettes indeed registered lower tar levels. However, Philip Morris knew something the government didn't. They knew about compensatory smoking. Internal experiments revealed that human beings are not robots. When a smoker uses a light cigarette, their brain craves a specific dose of nicotine. To get it from the diluted smoke, the smoker unconsciously changes their behavior. They inhale deeper, they hold the smoke longer, and, most critically, they cover the ventilation holes with their fingers or lips, effectively turning a light cigarette back into a full-strength one. Philip Morris scientists documented this phenomenon in secret memos. They knew that Marlboro lights were not safer. They were a fraud. In fact, they were arguably more dangerous because they encouraged smokers to inhale more vigorously, drawing the carcinogens deeper into the peripheral lung tissue, leading to a rise in a specific aggressive type of cancer called adenocarcinoma. Yet the company marketed lights as the rational choice for the health-conscious smoker. It was a health halo built on a foundation of physics-defying lies. They were selling a safety belt that snapped the moment you put it on. As the 1970s drew to a close, the Philip Morris empire was richer than ever, but it was living on borrowed time. The executives in New York, men like George Weissman, who ascended to the chairmanship in 1978, were sophisticated patrons of the arts. Weissman, a former PR man, poured money into the Lincoln Center and the Whitney Museum, trying to buy cultural immunity for the corporation. He wanted to be remembered as a Medici, not a merchant of death. But inside the factories, the chemists were brewing a new nightmare. They realized that lights and marketing were not enough to keep customers loyal in the face of growing health warnings. They needed to make the product itself more potent. They needed to hack the addiction. As 1980 approached, they began to industrialize the use of ammonia technology, the freebasing technique, on a massive scale. They were about to turn the cigarette from a simple agricultural product into a high-tech drug delivery system, a Franken cigarette designed to enslave the brain faster than ever before. The era of doubt was ending. The era of chemical warfare against the consumer was about to begin. As the 1980s began, the executives at Philip Morris faced a paradoxical crisis. They were winning the marketing war. Marlboro was the undisputed king of the global cigarette market, but they were losing the biological war. Despite the success of light cigarettes, smokers were still quitting in droves, driven away by the relentless drumbeat of medical warnings. The company realized that marketing alone could not overcome the fear of death. To keep their customers loyal, they needed to make the product physically harder to leave. They needed to stop selling a simple agricultural leaf and start selling a high-tech drug delivery device. This desperation birthed the era of Frankenstein science. Deep inside the company's research complex in Richmond, Virginia, the chemists took the ammonia technology discovered decades earlier and weaponized it on a massive industrial scale. This was the Manhattan Project of tobacco, industrializing addiction to ensure that customers remained physically enslaved to the product even as health warnings grew louder. They didn't put this on the label. They didn't tell the Surgeon General. They simply quietly rolled it out across the Marlboro line. The impact was devastating. Smokers found that other brands tasted weak or unsatisfying. They became physically enslaved to the specific ammonia-charged kick of a Marlboro. By the mid-1980s, this secret chemistry helped Philip Morris crush its competitors. R.J. Reynolds and Brown and Williamson were baffled. They couldn't understand why Marlboro was so much more addictive. Eventually, they had to reverse engineer the Philip Morris cigarette to discover the ammonia secret, sparking a chemical arms race that made every cigarette on Earth more lethal. But while the chemists were making the product more addictive, another team of scientists within Philip Morris was trying to do something even more radical. They were trying to make it safe. In the early 1980s, a secret team was assembled for Project Ariel. The mandate was to create a cigarette that didn't burn. The scientists knew that the cancer was caused by the combustion, the smoke, and the tar. If they could simply heat the tobacco enough to release the nicotine flavor without setting it on fire, they could theoretically eliminate most of the carcinogens. They succeeded. They built a prototype device that used a heat source to vaporize the tobacco. It was ugly and clunky, but the internal toxicology reports were miraculous. It produced almost no tar. It was, biologically speaking, a safe cigarette. This should have been the Holy Grail. It was a product that could save millions of lives and secure the company's future forever. But when the scientists presented Project Ariel to the senior executives and the legal department in New York, they were met not with applause, but with horror. The lawyers killed it. Their logic was a masterpiece of corporate sociopathy. They argued that if Philip Morris released a safe cigarette, They would be legally admitting that their existing cigarettes were unsafe. If they marketed Project Ariel as less toxic, it would imply that Marlboro Reds were more toxic. This admission would be used by plaintiffs' lawyers to sue them into bankruptcy. The existence of a safe alternative would prove that the company knew the current product was defective and had the means to fix it, but chose not to. It was a legal suicide pact. To protect the liability of the Marlboro Man, they had to suppress the cure. Project Ariel was shut down. The prototypes were destroyed. The patents were buried. The scientists were told to go back to work on ammonia. The executives made a conscious decision to continue selling a product they knew caused cancer rather than release a product that didn't, simply to protect their legal defense strategy in court. This decision defined the moral rot of the 1980s. The leadership of Philip Morris, men like Hamish Maxwell, who became CEO in 1984, were not ignorant. They were trapped in a prison of gold. They were earning billions of dollars a year, but they could never innovate, never apologize, and never change, because to do so would be to admit guilt. Instead, they doubled down on the doubt factory. As the 1980s progressed, the threat of secondhand smoke emerged as a new battleground. Non-smokers were beginning to demand smoke-free workplaces and restaurants. This was a lethal threat to the industry. If people couldn't smoke in public, they would smoke less. Philip Morris responded with a covert operations campaign. They launched the White Coat Project, a secret initiative to recruit scientists in Europe and Asia to publish studies proving that secondhand smoke was harmless. They paid these scientists through shell accounts to hide the tobacco industry's fingerprints. They created fake smokers' rights groups to protest bans in city halls. They turned the issue of public health into a culture war about liberty. By 1987, Philip Morris was a fortress under siege, but it was a fortress with walls made of money. They bought General Foods for $5.6 billion and Kraft for $13 billion, transforming themselves into the largest consumer goods company in the world. This diversification was a strategic shield. They wanted to hide the tobacco profits inside a boring food conglomerate. They wanted to make it impossible for the government to bankrupt them without also bankrupting the American supermarket. But they couldn't buy their way out of the looming betrayal. Deep inside the industry, the conscience of the scientists was beginning to fracture. The suppression of Project Ariel and the weaponization of ammonia had pushed some researchers too far. In 1988, a competitor, R.J. Reynolds, desperate to catch up to Marlboro, launched a marketing campaign that would accidentally wake the sleeping giant of the U.S. government. They introduced a cartoon character named Joe Camel. Joe Camel was cool. He wore sunglasses and a leather jacket. He played pool. And most critically, he was beloved by children. Studies began to show that 6-year-olds recognized Joe Camel as easily as Mickey Mouse. The naked targeting of children by the industry shattered the uneasy truce with Washington. It enraged parents and politicians. It set the stage for a new era of regulatory aggression. And amidst this rising storm, a man named Jeffrey Wigand was hired by Brown and Williamson as a vice president of research. Wigand was a believer in science. He thought he had been hired to make a safer cigarette. He did not yet know that he had walked into a crime scene and that he would soon become the man who would burn the entire doubt factory to the ground. The era of the Franken cigarette was peaking, but the day of reckoning was fast approaching. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the executives at Philip Morris found themselves fighting a war on a new and unexpected front: the nursery. The industry had always maintained a polite fiction that it only marketed to adults. But the launch of the Joe Camel campaign by rival R.J. Reynolds in 1988 shattered that illusion with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The cartoon camel, cool in his sunglasses and leather jacket, became an instant cultural phenomenon. While Philip Morris publicly distanced itself from the juvenile tactics of its competitor, privately, the executives were terrified, not because it was unethical, but because it was too effective. Joe Camel was waking the sleeping giant of the American public. Studies published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1991 revealed a statistic that stopped the hearts of parents across the nation. Joe Camel was as recognizable to 6-year-old children as Mickey Mouse. This revelation was the tipping point. It galvanized the anti-smoking movement, transforming it from a health crusade into a moral panic about child safety. The scrutiny on the entire industry intensified. Philip Morris, desperate to deflect attention from its own youth marketing, ramped up its doubt factory. But the cracks in the fortress were widening from the inside. In 1993, a scientist named Jeffrey Wiegand was fired from his position as Vice President of Research and Development at Brown & Williamson. Wiegand was not a typical tobacco executive. He was a man of science, hired with the promise that he could work on a safer cigarette. Instead, he found himself in a world of suppressed data, carcinogenic additives, and the weaponization of ammonia. Wiegand's firing was the catalyst for the greatest betrayal in the history of the industry. He decided to talk. He made contact with Lowell Bergman, a producer for CBS's 60 Minutes. Wiegand began to explain the Frankenstein science of the cigarette. He detailed how the companies manipulated nicotine levels. He explained the ammonia chemistry that turned nicotine into a freebase drug. He exposed the lie that the executives didn't know their product was addictive. The tobacco industry's response was immediate and terrifying. They didn't just sue Wiegand, they hunted him. He received death threats against his children. Bullets were left in his mailbox. Private investigators dug into his past, leaking stories about his divorce and shoplifting incidents to destroy his credibility. CBS, terrified of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit for tortious interference, initially killed the interview. It was a display of raw power that proved the industry could silence even the most prestigious news organization in America. But while Wiegand was being terrorized, a new sheriff had arrived in Washington. Dr. David Kessler, the commissioner of the FDA, was a man on a mission. He wanted to regulate tobacco. Historically, the FDA had never regulated cigarettes because the industry claimed they were agricultural products, not drugs. Kessler disagreed. He argued that because the companies manipulated the nicotine levels to sustain addiction, the cigarette was, by definition, a drug delivery device. To prove this, Kessler needed a smoking gun. He needed to prove intent. In early 1994, Kessler's investigators began to find the internal documents that Wiegand and others were hinting at. They found the patents for high nicotine tobacco strains. They found the memos about ammonia. The evidence was piling up. Sensing the existential threat, the tobacco industry decided to play its final, most dangerous card. They would go to Congress and lie to the face of the American people. On April 14, 1994, the CEOs of the 7 largest tobacco companies, including William Campbell of Philip Morris, appeared before the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment. It was a hearing that would be etched into the national consciousness. The 7 men, dressed in expensive suits, stood in a row. They raised their right hands. They swore to tell the truth. One by one, Congressman Henry Waxman asked them the question that defined the era. Do you believe nicotine is addictive? William Campbell of Philip Morris looked into the camera. His face was stony. I believe nicotine is not addictive, he said. The other 6 CEOs followed suit. I believe nicotine is not addictive. I believe nicotine is not addictive. It was the original sin of 1953, repeated on live television 40 years later. But this time, the public didn't buy it. The spectacle of the 7 dwarfs, as the media mocked them, denying a truth that every smoker in America knew in their bones, was the moment the industry lost its legitimacy. They didn't look like captains of industry. They looked like perjurers. The doubt factory had finally produced a product no one would buy. The lie was too big. Within weeks of the hearing, a paralegal at a law firm representing Brown and Williamson stole a box of secret documents. He mailed them to a professor at the University of California, San Francisco named Stanton Glantz. The box arrived in May 1994. It contained 4,000 pages of internal memos, research reports, and marketing plans dating back to the 1950s. It was the Rosetta Stone of the tobacco industry. The documents confirmed everything: the cancer research on mice, the addiction studies, the marketing to children, the conspiracy of silence. Glantz published the documents on the internet, a new technology that the tobacco companies couldn't control. The cigarette papers went viral. The era of doubt was over. The truth was out. The Philip Morris family, the heirs to the Bond Street shop, the creators of the Marlboro Man, were exposed as the architects of a 40-year criminal conspiracy. The science was clear, the addiction was engineered, and the executives were liars. As 1994 came to a close, the legal floodgates opened. The state of Mississippi filed a lawsuit to recover the Medicaid costs of treating smokers. It was the first domino. 49 other states would follow. The day of reckoning had arrived, and the bill for the Franken cigarette was about to come due in the form of the largest legal settlement in human history. As 1994 bled into 1995, the atmosphere inside the Philip Morris headquarters on Park Avenue shifted from arrogance to a bunker mentality. The televised perjury of the 7 dwarfs had stripped the executives of their dignity, but the leak of the cigarette papers had stripped them of their legal defenses. For 40 years, the doubt factory had operated on the premise that no one could prove what the company knew. Now the proof was on the internet. The reaction of the company was to lash out. They turned their Oppo research machine, the same apparatus used to discredit scientists, against their own whistleblower, Jeffrey Wigand. The campaign against Wigand was a masterclass in personal destruction. Philip Morris and its allies at Brown and Williamson hired private investigators to dig into every trash can of his life. They leaked a 500-page dossier to the Wall Street Journal accusing him of shoplifting, spousal abuse, and resume fraud. They threatened his children. They sued him for violating his non-disclosure agreement. They wanted to make him a pariah, a warning to anyone else inside the fortress who might be thinking of growing a conscience. But while they were hunting one man, they failed to notice the trap closing around the entire industry. The lawsuit filed by Mississippi Attorney General Mike Moore in May 1994 was a legal innovation that Philip Morris lawyers had not anticipated. Previously, smokers had sued companies as individuals. The industry always won those cases by blaming the smoker. Mike Moore changed the plaintiff. He didn't sue on behalf of a smoker. He sued on behalf of the state of Mississippi. He argued that the state had been forced to spend millions of taxpayer dollars treating sick smokers through Medicaid. The state hadn't chosen to smoke. The state was an innocent victim of fraud. This legal theory bypassed the issue of personal responsibility entirely. It framed Philip Morris not as a supplier of a vice, but as a defrauder of the public treasury. As the implications of this lawsuit sank in, the internal culture at Philip Morris descended into a kind of nihilistic cynicism. Marketing documents from 1995, later exposed in litigation, revealed just how low the executives were willing to go to find new customers to replace the dying ones. In San Francisco, the company launched a marketing plan codenamed Project SCUM. The acronym stood for Subculture Urban Marketing. The target demographic was the homeless and the gay community in the Tenderloin district. The plan involved flooding these vulnerable, marginalized neighborhoods with discounted cigarettes and targeted ads. The executives viewed these human beings not as customers to be won, but as scum to be harvested. It was the ultimate expression of the Franken cigarette philosophy. The product was a chemical weapon, and the target was anyone weak enough to fall for it. By the end of 1994, the doubt factory had effectively shut down. It could no longer produce doubt. The truth was too loud. The science of addiction was public. The perjury was recorded. The targeting of children and scum was documented. What happens when a whistleblower exposes the secret files? The 7 dwarves had perjured themselves on television, but they were not going down without a fight. When Jeffrey Wigand emerged as the threat to their empire, the industry's reaction was not a legal defense. It was a personal annihilation. In 1995, Philip Morris and Brown and Williamson authorized a campaign of terror that belonged in a Stasi handbook. They didn't just want to discredit him, they wanted to destroy his sanity. The final betrayal, however, came from the very institution Wigand had turned to for help, the media. Wigand had taped an explosive interview with Mike Wallace for CBS's 60 Minutes. It was the smoking gun interview, where he laid out the chemistry of addiction and the perjury of the 7 dwarfs. But just as the segment was set to air in November 1995, the corporate leadership of CBS, specifically the lawyers and the owner Lawrence Tisch, panicked. Philip Morris and Brown and Williamson threatened a $15 billion lawsuit against CBS for tortious interference if they aired the interview. They argued that by inducing Wigand to break his non-disclosure agreement, CBS was committing a crime. The executives at CBS buckled. In a moment of cowardice that stained the legacy of American journalism, they killed the interview. They chose to protect their stock price over the truth. Wigand was left exposed, alone, and silenced. He had sacrificed his career, his marriage, and his safety, only to be abandoned by the very people who had convinced him to jump. To the executives at Philip Morris, this was a triumph. They toasted their success in the boardrooms of Park Avenue. They believed they had crushed the rat. They had proven that the tobacco family was stronger than the truth. But they had underestimated the human element. They had underestimated the rage of a betrayed man and the ambition of a lawyer who smelled blood. Mike Moore, the Attorney General of Mississippi, watched the destruction of Wigand with a growing fury. He reached out to the broken scientist. He offered him a platform that CBS could not kill, a deposition in a court of law. In November 1995, in a secret deposition in Mississippi, Jeffrey Wigand finally spoke. Under oath, protected by the seal of the court, he laid out the secrets of the Franken cigarette. He detailed the ammonia chemistry. He confirmed that the CEOs had lied about addiction. When the transcript of that deposition was leaked, the dam broke. The 7 dwarfs were no longer just executives. They were exposed as perjurers. The 500-page dossier became worthless trash against the weight of Wigand's sworn testimony. The man they had tried to drive to suicide had instead driven a stake through the heart of their defense. As 1995 ended, The tobacco aristocracy realized that the old rules of intimidation no longer applied. They were facing a new reality where their billions could buy lawyers, but they could not buy their way out of the label that was now permanently affixed to their names, racketeers. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. The deposition of Jeffrey Wigand in late 1995 was a fatal wound to the tobacco industry's legal armor, but it was the events of 1996 that turned the wound septic. The curtain of silence maintained for 40 years by threats and money was ripped down not by a judge but by a traitor within the ranks. The traitor was Bennett Lebo, a corporate raider and the owner of the Liggett Group, the smallest of the 5 major tobacco companies. Liggett was the runt of the litter, struggling for market share with his discount brands like Chesterfield, and L&M Lebo was not part of the tobacco aristocracy. He was an outsider, a financier who cared about the stock price, not the omerta of the cartel. In March 1996, Lebo looked at the mounting wave of state lawsuits, Mississippi, Florida, Minnesota, and realized that the industry was going to lose. He calculated that if Liggett stayed in the fight, the legal fees alone would bankrupt his company. So, he decided to defect. In a move that stunned the executives at Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, Lebo announced that Liggett was settling with the states. As part of the deal, Liggett became the first tobacco company in history to officially admit what the industry had denied under oath for decades: smoking causes cancer and heart disease, and nicotine is addictive. This admission was a legal earthquake. For 40 years, the industry's defense had rested on the single premise that the science was inconclusive. Now, one of their own had admitted the truth in a signed legal document. It destroyed the United Front defense strategy. The other companies were no longer fighting a unified war. They were fighting a renegade who was handing ammunition to the enemy. But Lebo's betrayal went deeper. He handed over thousands of pages of internal Liggett documents. These Liggett documents, combined with the leaked cigarette papers from Brown and Williamson, created an undeniable mosaic of fraud. They showed the collusion, the youth marketing, and the suppression of safer alternatives. Inside the headquarters of Philip Morris, the mood shifted from defiance to panic. The executives, led by CEO Jeffrey Bible, realized they were trapped. The Seven Dwarfs testimony from 1994 was now, thanks to Liggett's admission, provable perjury. The Justice Department was circling. Shareholders were revolting. The stock was plummeting. Throughout 1997, the industry leaders engaged in secret, desperate negotiations with the state attorneys general. They knew they had to cut a deal to survive. They needed to buy their way out of the lawsuits before a jury in a hostile state like Mississippi or Florida handed down a verdict that would liquidate their assets. The negotiations were brutal. The attorneys general, led by Mike Moore, held all the cards. They demanded money, astronomical sums, but they also demanded the dismantling of the doubt factory. They wanted the internal documents made public. They wanted the dissolution of the fake research institutes. They wanted the end of the Marlboro man on billboards. On November 23, 1998, after months of sleepless nights and screaming matches in hotel conference rooms, the deal was signed. It was called the Master Settlement Agreement. The numbers were staggering. The 4 major tobacco companies, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown and Williamson, and Lorillard, agreed to pay the 46 settling states a total of $206 billion over the first 25 years, and to continue payments in perpetuity based on sales volume. It was and remains the largest civil litigation settlement in human history. But for the executives at Philip Morris, the MSA was not a surrender. It was a victory of survival. Yes, they had to pay $206 billion, but crucially, the settlement granted them immunity from future state lawsuits. It protected them from the death penalty of bankruptcy. Even more cynically, the executives knew exactly who would pay the bill. They did not dip into their personal fortunes or the company's cash reserves. On the day the MSA was signed, Philip Morris announced a massive price increase on every pack of Marlboros sold in America. They passed the cost of the fine directly to the addict. The smokers, the very people who were dying, were now being forced to pay a tax to the companies that killed them, which was then transferred to the states to pay for the health care costs of their dying. It was a circular economy of death. The poor, the addicted, and the sick were effectively paying the settlement for the billionaires who had lied to them. As the champagne corks popped in the law offices and the state capitals, celebrating the victory over big tobacco, the reality on the ground was grim. The settlement did not ban cigarettes. It did not reduce nicotine levels. It simply turned the state governments into silent partners in the tobacco business. Because the payments were tied to sales volume, the states now had a perverse financial incentive to ensure that people kept smoking. If everyone quit tomorrow, the $206 billion would vanish. For the victims, the MSA was a cold comfort. The money went to road projects and general funds, rarely to the families of the dead. And while the lawyers celebrated, the biological clock kept ticking for the industry's own icons. In 1995, just as the legal war was heating up, David McLean, the rugged Marlboro man of the 1960s TV ads, died of lung cancer. His death was slow and agonizing. He spent his final months tethered to an oxygen tank, a ghost of the cowboy who had once galloped across the screen. His widow sued Philip Morris, but the case was buried in legal motions. To the executives, McLean was just another line item, a depreciated asset who had served his purpose. The decade closed with Philip Morris battered but unbowed. They had lost the PR war. They had paid the largest fine in history, but they were still profitable. They were still selling billions of packs of Marlboros a year. But the legal nightmare was not over. The states had settled, but the federal government had not. In 1999, under the Clinton administration, the United States Department of Justice filed a massive civil lawsuit against the tobacco industry. The charge was not product liability. It was racketeering. The government accused Philip Morris and its peers of violating the RICO Act, the law designed to take down the mafia. The complaint argued that for 50 years, the tobacco companies had operated as a criminal enterprise, conspiring to deceive the public about the dangers of smoking. The government sought to disgorge $280 billion in ill-gotten gains. As the new millennium dawned, the executives at Philip Morris realized that the MSA was just a truce. The real war, the war for their liberty and their legacy, was about to be fought in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. The merchants of death were now officially defendants in a case titled United States versus Philip Morris. The family was about to be put on trial not as businessmen, but as mobsters. As the 21st century dawned, the executives at Philip Morris found themselves in a legal purgatory. They had survived the state lawsuits by paying the $206 billion master settlement agreement in 1998, but the federal government was not done. The United States Department of Justice, under Attorney General Janet Reno, had filed a massive civil racketeering lawsuit, United States versus Philip Morris, in 1999. This case would drag on for nearly 7 years, becoming the final definitive autopsy of the industry's crimes. The trial, which began in 2004, was not about money, it was about truth. The government sought to label the tobacco companies as racketeers under the RICO Act, a designation usually reserved for the mafia. The DOJ argued that for 50 years the executives had operated a coordinated criminal enterprise to defraud the American public. While the lawyers argued in court, the godfather of the modern tobacco industry faced his own final judgment. Joseph F. Coleman III, the man who had hired Leo Burnett, approved the Marlboro Man and lied on television in 1971, died in 2004 at the age of 92. His death was a study in contrast. Coleman died peacefully in his sleep at his estate, surrounded by the trappings of immense wealth, his hunting dogs, his tennis trophies, his philanthropy awards. He never spent a day in prison. He never faced a jury. He died believing he was a titan of industry, a patriot who had served his country. Meanwhile, the men he had hired to sell his product were dying very different deaths. The cowboys, the Marlboro men, were expiring in sterile hospital rooms, gasping for air through oxygen masks, their bodies ravaged by the products Coleman had sworn were safe. The death of the patriarch marked the end of the personal era of the dynasty. The company was now run by technocrats, lawyers in suits who viewed the business as a liability management exercise. In 2006, the verdict in the federal RICO case finally arrived. Judge Gladys Kessler issued a stinging 1,683-page opinion. It was a historical indictment. She ruled that the tobacco companies had marketed and sold their lethal product with zeal, with deception, with a single-minded focus on their financial success, and without regard for the human tragedy or social costs. Judge Kessler officially branded Philip Morris and its peers as racketeers. She ordered them to issue corrective statements, ads in newspapers and on television, admitting that they had lied about the addictiveness of nicotine, the dangers of secondhand smoke, and the fraud of light cigarettes. For the executives, this was a humiliation, but it was not a death blow. The judge, constrained by appellate court rulings, could not order the disgorgement of the $280 billion in ill-gotten profits the DOJ had sought. The company would have to apologize, but it could keep the money. The day of reckoning had arrived, but the punishment was moral, not financial. However, the brand Philip Morris had become toxic. It was synonymous with death and deception. The executives realized they needed a new mask. They needed to separate the sin businesses from the safe businesses they had acquired over the years. In 2003, the company executed a massive corporate rebranding. They changed the name of the parent holding company from Philip Morris Companies Incorporated to Altria Group. It was a transparent attempt to hide in plain sight. Altria sounded like a pharmaceutical company or a benevolent NGO. It was sterile, vague, and disconnected from the history of tobacco. The logo was a colorful mosaic designed to evoke diversity and innovation, not smoke and ash. But the public wasn't fooled. Critics called it putting lipstick on a pig. The rebranding was the final admission that the family name of the founder, Philip Morris, was no longer an asset. It was a liability. The dynasty was trying to erase its own identity to survive. As the decade wore on, the Altria era was defined by a desperate attempt to diversify away from the dying cigarette market. They spun off Kraft Foods in 2007, separating the macaroni and cheese from the Marlboros to protect the food giant from tobacco lawsuits. They spun off Philip Morris International in 2008, creating a separate legal entity for their overseas operations. This split was a cynical masterstroke. By separating the U.S. business from the international business, they quarantined the American legal liabilities. Altria would stay in the U.S., fighting the declining market and the lawsuits, while PMI would be free to aggressively market Marlboros to the developing world, to countries with weaker regulations and growing populations of smokers in Asia and Africa. They were exporting the original sin to new shores, but the ghosts of the past refused to stay buried. In 2009, George Weissman, the marketing genius who had helped invent the Marlboro Man and push the Virginia Slims campaign, died. Unlike Coleman, Weissman's death carried a grim poetic justice. The man who had spent his life selling smoke died of lung cancer. It was the final brutal punchline to the curse. The architect of the cowboy killer was killed by his own creation. Even the kings of the empire were not immune to the biological reality of their product. Weissman's death served as a dark bookend to the era. The men who had built the doubt factory were gone, consumed by the very fire they had lit. By 2008, the reckoning was complete. The lawsuits were settled, the fines were paid, the names were changed, and the founders were dead. Altria stood as a profitable, hollowed-out giant, a company that generated billions in cash but possessed zero moral authority. They had survived the government, the lawyers, and the science, but they were presiding over a dying industry. Smoking rates in the U.S. were plummeting. They needed a new product, a new way to addict the next generation. And in the laboratories of Silicon Valley, a new technology was emerging that would offer them a lifeline. It wasn't a leaf, it was a liquid. It wasn't smoke, it was vapor. The merchants of death were about to discover the e-cigarette, and the cycle of addiction was preparing to begin all over again. As the first decade of the new millennium neared its close, Altria found itself in a peculiar position. It was a victor in the courtroom, but a pariah in the culture. The racketeering verdict of 2006 had branded the executives as liars, but it had left their bank accounts intact. They had successfully spun off Kraft and Philip Morris International, creating a fortress of domestic tobacco revenue that was, for the moment, legally secure. But the business model itself, burning dried leaves to inhale nicotine, was facing a technological extinction event. Smoking rates were plummeting. The youth were rejecting the cigarette. The Marlboro Man was dying, not just biologically, but culturally. The executives needed a bridge to the future. They needed a way to deliver nicotine that didn't carry the stigma of cancer and ash. They began to look at the burgeoning, unregulated world of e-cigarettes. In the late 2000s, the e-cigarette was a fringe product, a clunky device sold in mall kiosks. But Altria's strategists saw the potential. They realized that if they could separate the nicotine from the smoke, they could sidestep 50 years of health regulations. They could sell addiction without the death, or at least without the proven death. This pivot marked the beginning of the next generation product strategy. It was a cynical rebranding of the harm reduction arguments they had used with filtered cigarettes in the 1950s and low-tar cigarettes in the 1970s. Once again, they were promising a safer way to be addicted. While the corporate machine was retooling for the vape era, the human toll of the combustible era continued to mount, often in the most intimate circles of the tobacco family. The death of George Weissman in 2009 from lung cancer was a grim milestone, but it wasn't the only one. Across the country, the widows and children of the Marlboro men were fighting lonely, losing battles in court. The case of David McLean, the Marlboro man who died in 1995, finally ground to a halt in the mid-2000s. His family's lawsuit, which argued that he was forced to smoke lethal amounts on set, was dismissed due to legal technicalities regarding statutes of limitations. The company's defense was brutal. McLean knew the risks, and he cashed the checks. They argued, successfully in the eyes of the law, that a man paid to sell death has no right to complain when it comes for him. This legal callousness was mirrored in the company's handling of the Engel progeny cases in Florida. After a massive class action verdict was overturned in 2006, the Florida Supreme Court allowed thousands of individual smokers to sue Philip Morris. The company adopted a scorched earth litigation strategy. They fought every single sick, dying smoker in court, dragging out trials until the plaintiffs died, forcing grieving families to spend years seeking compensation. It was a war of attrition, funded by the inexhaustible profits of the Marlboro brand. By 2008, the Day of Reckoning had calcified into a permanent state of legal siege. The master settlement agreement payments were flowing to the states billions of dollars a year. But the states had become addicted to the money. They used the tobacco cash to balance their budgets, not to fight smoking. In a perverse twist, the state governments became silent partners with Altria. If Altria went bankrupt, the states would lose a massive revenue stream. The settlement had effectively made the government a stakeholder in the continued sale of cigarettes. As the financial crisis of 2008 rocked the global economy, Altria remained remarkably stable. Nicotine, it turned out, was recession-proof. People might stop buying new cars, but they didn't stop smoking. The company's stock actually outperformed the market during the crash. The merchants of death were the only ones making a reliable living. The era of the Day of Reckoning concluded not with the bang of a gavel, but with the quiet, calculated realignment of a corporate colossus preparing for its next evolution. By the end of 2008, the Philip Morris family, now hidden behind the sterile mask of Altria, had successfully weathered the greatest legal storm in the history of American commerce. They had paid the $206 billion blood tax of the Master Settlement Agreement. They had survived the RICO verdict that branded them as racketeers. They had watched their founders and their icons die of the disease they sold, bearing them with honors while fighting their widows in court. The company had emerged from the tobacco wars financially scarred, but structurally intact. They had achieved a state of equilibrium with the U.S. government. They were allowed to exist, provided they paid their sin taxes and kept their marketing invisible. But inside the headquarters in Richmond, the executives knew that this equilibrium was a slow death. The actuarial tables were clear. Their core customer base was dying faster than it could be replaced. The Franken cigarette, for all its chemical ingenuity, was a technology of the past. To survive the 21st century, the merchants of death needed to stop selling death, or at least stop selling the kind of death that looked like a burning leaf. They needed to pivot from combustion to vapor. This realization set the stage for the company's aggressive entry into the smokeless market. In 2009, Altria acquired UST Inc., the makers of Skoal and Copenhagen smokeless tobacco, for $11.7 billion. It was a diversification play, a bet on oral nicotine as a safer alternative. But the true future was being built in the labs of Silicon Valley, where two Stanford graduate students, Adam Bowen and James Monsees, were prototyping a device that would eventually become Juul, the pivot to electronic nicotine delivery. But the innovation that would save the industry did not come from the tobacco fields of Virginia. It came from the design labs of Stanford University. In the mid-2000s, two graduate students named Adam Bowen and James Monsees were studying product design. They were smokers, but they hated the stigma and the smell. They decided to apply the ethos of Silicon Valley, disruption, sleek design, and user experience, to the problem of nicotine addiction. Their thesis project evolved into a company called Plume, which eventually morphed into Pax Labs, and finally, in 2015, spun off a product that would change the world, Juul. The Juul device was a masterpiece of industrial design. It didn't look like a cigarette. It looked like a USB flash drive. It was metallic, minimalist, and charged in a laptop port. It didn't produce a thick, choking cloud of smoke. It produced a thin, dissipating wisp of vapor that smelled like creme brulee or mango. It was the iPhone of nicotine, a gadget that stripped away the aesthetic of death and replaced it with the aesthetic of tech. But the true genius of Juul was not the hardware, it was the chemistry. Bowen and Monsees had rediscovered the secret sauce that Philip Morris had pioneered in the 1960s, freebase nicotine. By using nicotine salts derived from tobacco leaves and mixing them with benzoic acid, they created a liquid that could deliver a massive, punchy dose of nicotine into the bloodstream without the harsh throat hit of traditional cigarettes. A single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as a pack of 20 cigarettes, yet it went down as smooth as flavored air. It was the perfect trap, and it was aimed squarely at a demographic that big tobacco had been legally barred from targeting for decades: children. Juul's launch campaign, titled Vaporized, was a direct digital echo of the Joe Camel strategy. They didn't buy billboards, they bought influencers. They flooded Instagram and Snapchat with images of young, beautiful models partying with JUULS in their hands. They held launch parties in New York and Los Angeles that looked like raves. They gave away free devices to cool kids on college campuses. The result was an epidemic. Within 2 years, Juuling became a verb. High school bathrooms across America were transformed into vaping lounges. Teachers reported students vaping in class, hiding the devices in their sleeves. A generation that had successfully been inoculated against cigarettes, Gen Z, was suddenly, en masse, addicted to nicotine salts. Altria watched this explosion from Richmond with a mixture of envy and opportunity. They saw Juul doing exactly what they had always wanted to do, but were legally forbidden from attempting: hooking a new generation. They saw the staggering growth. Juul's valuation rocketed from nothing to $38 billion in 3 years. And they saw their own future. In December 2018, Altria made its move. In a deal that shocked the business world and enraged public health advocates, the maker of Marlboro announced it was buying a 35% stake in Juul Labs for $12.8 billion. It was a deal with the devil. Altria was effectively outsourcing its future to a startup. They provided Juul with something the tech bros needed desperately: shelf space. Altria used its massive distribution network to put Juul pods next to Marlboro packs in every 7-Eleven and gas station in America. They put the Marlboro marketing muscle behind the Mango pod. The message was clear. The old killer and the new killer had joined forces. The dynasty of ash had bought the dynasty of vapor. But just as the champagne was popping in the boardrooms, the biological bill came due. In the summer of 2019, emergency rooms across the United States began to see a terrifying new phenomenon. Teenagers and young adults were arriving with lungs that looked like they had been ravaged by mustard gas or industrial chemical spills. They were coughing up blood. They couldn't breathe. Their lungs were turning into popcorn, filled with solidified fluid and scar tissue. The condition was named EVALI. By early 2020, nearly 3,000 people had been hospitalized and 68 had died. While many cases were linked to black market THC vapes containing vitamin E acetate, the panic was universal. The image of the safe vape was shattered. Parents watched in horror as their athletic teenagers were placed on ventilators. The backlash was ferocious. The FDA, under pressure from terrified parents and angry lawmakers, raided JUUL's headquarters. They seized documents proving that JUUL had intentionally marketed to minors. The mango and mint flavors, the hooks that caught the kids, were banned. Schools filed class action lawsuits, accusing Juul and Altria of creating a public nuisance, echoing the language of the opioid and asbestos litigation. For Altria, the $12.8 billion investment turned into a financial albatross. As Juul's valuation collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and regulatory bans, Altria was forced to write down the value of its stake. They had paid billions for a company that was now worth pennies. It was a rare moment of financial karma. The company that had invented the doubt factory had finally been swindled by its own greed, buying into a safer alternative that turned out to be a toxic asset. But the financial loss was nothing compared to the human cost. The vaporized generation was now locked in. Millions of teenagers who had never smoked a cigarette were physically dependent on high-dose nicotine. And as the vape bans took effect, many of them did exactly what the executives at Altria had secretly hoped they would do. They switched to cigarettes. The cycle was complete. The snake had shed its skin, but the venom was the same. As the legal dust from the Juul debacle settled in 2023, Altria made a strategic retreat, selling its remaining stake in the disgraced vape company for a fraction of its original value. But the retreat was merely a tactical repositioning, not a surrender. The merchants of death had learned from their Silicon Valley misadventure. They realized they didn't need to partner with tech bros to sell addiction. They could do it themselves using a new technology that promised to be the final evolution of the cigarette. This technology was heat not burn. Marketed under the brand name IQOS, this device was the holy grail Philip Morris had been chasing since the failed Project Ariel of the 1980s. It didn't burn tobacco. It heated it to 350 degrees Celsius, releasing a nicotine-laced aerosol that tasted like a cigarette, but according to company science, contained fewer carcinogens. It was the perfect bridge for the doubt factory in the 21st century. It allowed the company to once again claim it was part of the solution, offering a smoke-free future while continuing to sell the very addictive substance that kept the future smoky. By 2024, IQOS had conquered markets in Japan and Europe and was poised for a massive rollout in the United States. The cycle of innovation was complete, from the hand-rolled cigarettes of Bond Street to the filtered Marlboros of the 1950s, from the low-tar scams of the 1970s to the high-tech vapes of the 2010s. The dynasty had consistently found a way to repackage death as progress. But the true legacy of the Philip Morris/Altria family is not found in their new gadgets. It is found in the graveyards of the world. The curse of the founder has been industrialized on a scale that defies comprehension. Epidemiologists estimate that in the 20th century alone, tobacco killed 100 million people globally. If current trends continue, the World Health Organization predicts that number will rise to 1 billion in the 21st century. The graves of the Marlboro men, David McLean, Wayne McLaren, Darrell Winfield, stand as lonely monuments to this toll. They are the celebrity victims, the faces we recognize, but behind them are the millions of anonymous dead, the fathers who died of heart attacks at 50, the mothers who died of emphysema, the waiters who died of secondhand smoke. They are the collateral damage of a business model that prioritized shareholder value over human survival. The executives who orchestrated this carnage, men like Joseph Coleman III and George Weissman, are also gone, buried in respectable cemeteries, their obituaries praising their philanthropy and business acumen. They escape the judgment of a criminal court, but they cannot escape the judgment of history. They will be remembered not as captains of industry, but as the architects of a genocide of convenience. Today, Altria sits in its headquarters in Richmond, a quiet, profitable giant. It pays its dividends. It lobbies Congress. It funds the arts. But the air around it is heavy with the ghosts of its customers. The dynasty of Ash has burned through a century of human life, leaving behind nothing but a vast, silent cloud of smoke. The Marlboro Man may be gone from the billboards, but his silhouette still rides across the American landscape, a dark rider reminding us that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to feel free.